Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep. Welcome to our brand new initiative, the Knowledge Series. In this initiative, every day at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m., we are going to discuss important static topics from all the important subjects. The intention, the objective is to help you cover all these important topics which are going to be very relevant for the upcoming mains, for the 2022 mains. It will also help the 2023 aspirants for both prelims and mains. With this intention, we have launched this ambitious initiative called the Knowledge Series. So do watch these sessions live without fail. Even tomorrow, we have a session on polity and geography, and the sessions go live at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. Today, the topic for discussion is NATO. We have chosen a topic from international relations, and the topic we are going to cover is NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. But before we begin, let me ask you to express your support to this initiative. If you're benefiting from this, like the video, share your comments. We've also enabled the chat box, so do interact with us live. And at the end of the session, we're also going to take your questions. Whatever doubts you have on the topic, please feel free to ask your questions. And at the end, I'm going to answer all of them. The intention is to help you understand these important topics completely, to have complete conceptual clarity so that you can easily prepare for both prelims and mains. So do let us know how you're liking the initiative, do give your support, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. So let's start with today's session. Today we're going to talk about a very, very important international organization that's very relevant for international relations. We're going to discuss NATO, or the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which is essentially an intergovernmental military alliance. The topic of NATO is very important for your exams because NATO has been in news over the last few years, especially in the last few months. NATO is a very important military grouping. It's a military alliance essentially. Expansion of NATO towards Eastern Europe is said to be one of the reasons which triggered Russia to step up tensions with Ukraine and eventually invade Ukraine. So this is what makes NATO very important because it plays a critical role in European geopolitics. So let's understand everything about NATO, the basic facts which is needed for your prelims, and we'll also focus on an in-depth discussion through which you'll develop a critical understanding of the topic so that you'll be able to write a critical answer in mains if a question comes up. See, NATO is an intergovernmental military alliance that was set up in 1949 primarily by the Western countries. This military alliance today consists of 30 member states. There are 27 European states, most of which are members of the European Union as well. We also have two North American states, that is the United States and Canada. And there is one transcontinental country which is a member of NATO, that is Turkey. Even Turkey happens to be a very important member of this group. So the NATO is headquartered at Brussels in Belgium. These are some essential facts that one should be aware with regard to NATO for your prelims. But this factual information alone is not sufficient for your exams. You need to go beyond this. You need to develop greater clarity on this topic. And like I said, you should be able to develop critical thinking, critical analysis on this important topic. Because NATO is definitely an expected topic for your mains. It could also come as a question in your personality test, in your interview round. So you should be able to have a debate on NATO, understand its origin, understand the rationale behind which NATO was formed, understand why is it significant today and why was Russia triggered by the NATO, right? So let's have that in-depth discussion for the next few minutes, and at the end I'll be answering all your doubts and queries. See, the primary reason why the NATO was set up was to promote the principle of collective defense. The principle of collective defense is at the very heart of this military alliance. This forms the central pillar of NATO. Now, what do you mean by collective defense? What is this concept of collective defense? Collective defense means that if one country, if one member of a group is attacked by an external party, by a third country, then all the other members of that organization, they will commit that they will collectively fight against the threat. They will deploy their military resources to defend their co-member, one of their partners in the grouping, and they will collectively fight against the external threat. In fact, this principle of self-defense, it is even enshrined under Article 51 of the UN Charter. The UN Charter is the constitution of the United Nations. So under the UN Charter, we have Article 51 that recognizes the right to self-defense. It recognizes both the individual right to self-defense and as well as the collective right to self-defense. So if a country is attacked by another country, the country has an individual right to self-defense as per Article 51 of the UN Charter. Similarly, if a country is under attack or if a group of countries are under attack, they can collectively organize their defense, meaning they can all deploy their resources together, go to war against the other country which is attacking them. So these concepts of individual and collective defense are recognized under this important principle of the UN Charter, that is Article 51 of the UN Charter. This principle forms the very basis of NATO, which is enshrined under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty. The North Atlantic Treaty forms the basis of this military grouping called NATO, right? NATO as a military alliance was created through the North Atlantic Treaty in 1949. It draws its inspiration from Article 51 of the UN Charter, and under Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, the NATO commits all the members towards collective defense of each other. That is, the parties have agreed that an armed attack against any one or more of them in Europe or North America, that is basically across the North Atlantic region, it shall be treated as an attack against all of them, right? They will treat this as a collective security threat and they will collectively organize their defense. All the other members will come to the defense of the other country which is under attack. This is the very core principle of this military alliance. However, this principle of collective defense has been invoked by NATO only once till date. That is after the 9/11 attacks. After the 9/11 attacks of 2001, which was carried out by Al-Qaeda against the United States. That was the first and only instance when NATO invoked the principle of collective defense. Because after the 9/11 attacks, the US declared a global war on terrorism and all the NATO countries saw this as a collective attack. So, under the principle of collective defense, they joined the US, created a coalition force and went to war against terrorism, right? But now, we shall go back in time and understand the origin of NATO. What was the rationale that formed the basis for the creation of this military alliance? Like I said, this grouping was created in 1949, that is after the end of the Second World War, right? The Second World War had just ended in 1945 and the Cold War rivalry had started between the two superpowers. The two power blocks led by United States and the Soviet Union. They had entered into a strategic rivalry, a geopolitical rivalry. The United States and the other Western countries, they represented the principles of democracy and capitalism, whereas Soviet Union and its allies, on the other hand, represented the principles of communism and socialism. This was essentially an ideological conflict that extended to strategic rivalry and geopolitical conflict that was primarily centered around Europe. So during this period, the Western countries led by US and West European countries, they saw the Soviet Union as a threat. They perceived a direct threat from the Soviet Union. See, this is where you need a little bit of background. After the Second World War had ended, Europe had been destroyed. There was complete destruction in Europe. European countries had to rebuild themselves from scratch. So this is where the US came out with an economic assistance plan called the Marshall Plan. The then US President, Harry Truman, under the Truman administration, the Marshall Plan was proposed. What was the Marshall Plan? The Marshall Plan was basically an economic assistance program to the European countries which had been ravaged during the Second World War. Through the Marshall Plan, the US was providing financial and economic assistance to European countries to rebuild their economies, to rebuild their infrastructure. Through this, the US was looking to expand its influence, to bring West European countries and the other Central and East European countries under its sphere of influence. It was looking to promote democracy and capitalism, right? It was looking to protect its traditional sphere of influence. So when this economic plan was offered by the US, the other power bloc, the rival of the US, the Soviet Union, declined to accept this assistance under Marshall Plan. The Soviet Union not only declined, but it also convinced its allies in Central Europe and especially in Eastern Europe to not receive any American economic assistance under the Marshall Plan. So this clearly marked the emergence of a divide. The Soviet Union was looking to protect its traditional sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and also in Central Europe. The US was looking to expand its influence through this economic assistance provided under the Marshall Plan. So the Soviet Union rejected the offer, and it was becoming very clear that the two superpowers were headed for a collision. It was in this context that the NATO was established by US and European countries, especially West European countries, as a counter to the influence of the Soviet Union, to the threats posed by the Soviet Union. In fact, in the late 1940s, there were a series of developments in Europe that clearly depicted the rivalry that had begun between US and Soviet Union. This was the beginning of the Cold War. Between 1946 and 1949, the Greek Civil War had broken out in today's Greece. Over here, the Soviet Union was looking to promote a communist takeover of the Greek government. It was looking to install a pro-communist government. This was actively countered by US and UK, which saw Soviet influence and communist influence as a threat. The same happened later in Turkey. See, Turkey has control over two strategic straits called the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait. Turkey controls these important straits that connect the Black Sea with the Mediterranean Sea. Now, this is crucial for Soviet Union and even today for Russia, because this is the only route for Soviet Union or today's Russia to access the Mediterranean. Later, I'll show you a map as well, and I'll explain why Turkey and the Bosphorus Strait and Dardanelles Strait are critical. Russia or Soviet Union, they've always desired having access to the Black Sea, because through this they can access the Bosphorus Strait and the Dardanelles Strait and further reach out into the Mediterranean. This was an economic and strategic imperative for the Soviet Union, and it is today for Russia as well. So because of this, to retain their access to the Mediterranean, to retain their dominance in the Black Sea, and to ensure that Soviet Union controls Bosphorus and Dardanelles Strait, it tried sponsoring unrest in Turkey, and it tried installing a pro-communist government in Turkey as well. So here again, the Western countries led by US and UK countered the Soviet Union. The same would happen across European countries, especially in East Europe and Central Europe. In Czechoslovakia, Joseph Stalin, the then leader of Soviet Union, would again try to install a pro-communist regime, right? So these Cold Wars, these covert proxy wars continued between the Western countries and the Soviet Union. And now the Americans and the Europeans were convinced that the Soviet Union was an existential threat for them. By this time, the arms race had begun. The nuclear armed race had begun, and the outer space race had also begun. So during these heightened tensions, the United States and its European allies, they collectively believed that they had a threat from the Soviet Union. They perceived a military threat. So they decided to organize themselves and form a collective defense against the Soviet Union, because day by day, Soviet aggression was increasing, and this is what the Americans and the Europeans wanted to counter. Most European countries in West Europe, they also had a similar assessment. They perceived that the increasing aggression of Soviet Union is a threat to their existence, and that is why they signed the Brussels Treaty of Collective Defense in 1948. It was signed by the UK, France, Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So these countries, they first brought out the principle of collective defense, and they came together through the Brussels Treaty of Collective Defense. This is said to be the precursor to the NATO. Then a few months later in the United States, the US Congress brought out the Vandenberg Resolution. This resolution urged the American president to seek out collective defense and mutual defense arrangements with European partners to stand up to Soviet aggression and Soviet influence. Under the Vandenberg Resolution, the United States was basically looking for a military alliance outside of the UN. See, earlier I told you that under the UN Charter, collective defense and self-defense is recognized. That is under Article 51. But the problem is, the North American countries and European countries were concerned that through the UN they can never implement collective defense, because at the UN, that is at the UN Security Council, Soviet Union itself is a permanent member. It enjoys the veto. So if the North Atlantic allies across North America and Europe, if they were to look for collective defense under Article 51 of the UN, it would be countered and defeated by the Soviet Union at the UN Security Council, which has the veto power. So they realized that collective defense under UN cannot be organized against the Soviet Union. So they started looking for an arrangement outside of the UN, a military alliance outside of the UN, while invoking the principle and doctrine of collective defense. This was brought out in the Vandenberg Resolution. That is why it is considered as a stepping stone to the NATO. The Vandenberg Resolution combined with the Brussels Treaty is what pushed the United States and its European allies to come together to form this military alliance later called the NATO, which would bring out the principle of collective defense but outside of the United Nations. So with this, the NATO was formed. The North Atlantic Treaty was signed in the year 1949 and the military alliance was set up. Initially, 12 countries were part of this military alliance. European countries like Belgium, Denmark, France, Italy and the others, they joined NATO along with Canada, United States, UK and a few other European countries. A total of 12 countries came together to form the NATO. Then very quickly, Greece and Turkey were also added in 1952. Then later Germany also joined, that is West Germany I'm referring to. West Germany also joined the NATO, and eventually in 1982, Spain also joined the NATO. So day by day NATO was expanding, it was increasing its influence across Europe. And especially after the Soviet Union disintegrated, after the Soviet Union collapsed, very quickly NATO expanded its membership and influence and even included countries like Poland, Czech Republic, Hungary and the others, which were all under the Soviet influence, right? You can clearly see over here, the map here depicts the expansion of NATO over the years, especially after 1991, especially after the Soviet Union disintegrated and collapsed. Very quickly, many Central and East European countries, which until then were under Soviet influence, they were all added into NATO. Countries like Bulgaria, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, right? These three countries I'm referring to, they were all part of the Soviet Union, right? These are the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania. They were all part of the Soviet Union. So former Soviet members were now joining the NATO. Essentially, NATO was sharing direct borders with Soviet Union, right? So the successor state to Soviet Union was obviously Russia, and Russia perceived this expansion of NATO as a direct threat. So as the NATO countries started sharing borders with the successor state of Soviet Union, that's Russia, Russia saw this as an existential threat. Over the years, NATO has expanded even further. Recently, countries like Montenegro and even North Macedonia, they've joined NATO again. The last member to join was North Macedonia in 2020. This can be an important fact for your prelims. So like this, NATO has expanded its membership and influence, and along with this, the United States and European countries, they have stationed their military assets in Central and Eastern Europe. This is what Russia sees as a threat. See, tensions with Russia have gone up for NATO countries because of this direct confrontation that they have been having since 1950s. These tensions between Russia and NATO, they're nothing new. In fact, from the 1950s itself, the then Soviet Union formed a counter to the NATO by signing the Warsaw Pact. The Warsaw Pact brought together East European countries along with Soviet Union, and this military standoff in Europe led to the emergence of the Iron Curtain, which was marking the physical divide or the physical barrier between West Europe and East Europe. as NATO countries aligned together, the Warsaw Pact countries like Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany and Albania, they all aligned with the Soviet Union. They started countering the military deployments of the NATO countries. They started building physical barriers. They started erecting hard border control measures, deploying their armed forces, missiles. So this eventually became a physical divide that divided Europe, that divided the west and east of Europe, which is referred to as the Iron Curtain. So during this period, there were heightened tensions between the NATO countries and the Warsaw Pact countries. But after Soviet Union disintegrated and collapsed, the Warsaw Pact countries, they not only abandoned their alliance with Russia, the successor state of Soviet Union, but many of them would go on to join the NATO in the coming years. For example, see today Soviet Union, Czechoslovakia and East Germany, they no longer exist. Right? Soviet Union disintegrated, that marked the end of the Cold War in 1991. Czechoslovakia also fell apart and it disintegrated into different countries like Slovakia. East Germany eventually merged with West Germany. Germany unified in 1989, 1990, right? So these countries no longer exist of the Warsaw Pact. But the other members of Warsaw Pact, like Poland, for example, then Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, these are the other members of Warsaw Pact who were under Soviet influence. But they've all joined NATO eventually. In the last few decades, they've all joined NATO. And in this map here, you can clearly see the expanding influence and presence of the NATO countries. Former members of Soviet Union, like the Baltic states, such as Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they have joined NATO. So NATO shares borders with Russia over here, right? Norway has been a member of NATO, shares a border over here with Russia. And the Warsaw Pact countries you're seeing in the map, like Poland, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria and the others, right? And the Balkan states over here, they've all joined NATO post-1990s, especially after 1997, there has been a significant expansion of NATO. Essentially, NATO has expanded its boundaries and the US and the West European countries, they started deploying their military assets in East Europe. They started deploying their air defense systems. They started stationing their troops. They brought advanced missiles to Central Europe and East Europe, which would threaten Russia. So the successor state of Soviet Union, that is Russia, has always perceived this as a threat. The expansion of NATO has been seen as an existential threat by Russia. Especially when they tried to pull Ukraine into their grouping, that is when Russia was triggered. In the last 15 years, NATO has been making active attempts to bring Ukraine as well under its membership. For Russia, this is unacceptable because Ukraine was a former member of the Soviet Union and one of its closest allies at one point of time, right? Russia could not stand losing influence in Ukraine, which is strategically and economically crucial for Russia. In Ukraine as well, the politics changed. Governments came up which were favoring NATO, and in Ukraine, governments came up which were acting against Russian interests. So as this alliance started growing between NATO and Ukraine, Russia decided to retaliate. So that is why Russia moved to occupy the Crimean Peninsula that you can see over here in the Black Sea, the strategic Crimean Peninsula, right? It belonged to Ukraine, but in 2014, Russia occupied it. It annexed Crimea so that it could control and dominate the Black Sea. If Russia controls the Black Sea, it will have access to the Turkish straits, which are located over here. That is the Bosphorus and the Dardanelles Straits. Through this, Russia can reach out into the Mediterranean. So that is why Russia has tried at any cost to prevent the further expansion of NATO, especially the joining of Ukraine into NATO. But the increasing tensions led Russia to sponsor a separatist war in the Donbas region, that is in eastern Ukraine, in Donetsk and Luhansk provinces. And eventually, Russia mobilized troops and invaded the country as well just a few months back. As Ukraine was aligning more and more with Western countries and NATO, as it was receiving military assistance from the US, Russia decided to retaliate and it carried out an entire invasion of the country. So this is the war that's going on in the last few months, and these are some of the reasons that triggered the Russian invasion of Ukraine and the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. But Russia's actions has had an opposite effect. Russia was trying to halt NATO's expansion, NATO's influence, by attacking Ukraine, by destabilizing Ukraine. But it has had the opposite effect because other countries like Sweden and Finland, right, which share boundaries with Russia, they have felt threatened and they have applied for NATO's membership recently. Now that is why the topic of NATO is very, very important for your exams. Sweden and Finland just a few weeks back have submitted their applications to join the NATO, right? If they are admitted, if they become full-time members of NATO, then Finland, especially over here, will share a 1,200 kilometer border with Russia, which essentially would become a NATO border. See, already NATO countries like Norway, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, they were already sharing around 1,300 kilometers border with Russia. Now, if Finland is admitted, the border between NATO countries and Russia will double to 2,500, 2,600 kilometers. So Russia sees this as an existential threat because NATO countries are going to move to station their military assets, and Russia sees this as a containment strategy. In fact, Russia already feels threatened that its access to Baltic Sea might be contained because most of the Baltic countries over here, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, then Poland and Germany, they're all firmly aligned with the US. They're all members of the NATO. If Sweden also joins, Sweden has an important island over here in the Baltic Sea, which could be used as a military base to contain Russia and limit Russia's access to the Baltic Sea, thereby limit Russia's access to the Atlantic Ocean itself. So these are the recent developments that bring NATO into news, right? This is what you need to understand about its origin, its history, the rationale behind which it was set up, and what are the reasons for its expansion, how Russia sees this as a threat, and why is it important in today's geopolitics, right? With this understanding, I would like to bring our discussion to an end. Before we end, let me also highlight few potential areas for questions. Let me highlight few areas where you can expect a prelims question or a mains question so that you're adequately prepared for this topic. In prelims, I would suggest please go through the members of NATO again. Remember the members. Take a look at the history of this grouping, the origin and the rationale that we discussed. Take a look at the expansion of NATO that has happened, especially the new members who have joined and the new members who have applied for membership like Sweden and Finland, right? Along with that, I'm going to give you an assignment. I'm going to give you a small exercise here. I want you to read about the membership process to NATO. How can a country apply for NATO's membership? Which country can become a NATO member? What is the membership criteria? Just read about this. Can India become a member of NATO, right? To answer that, you should know what is the membership criteria. Which countries can apply for NATO's membership? So just read about this, take this as an assignment from my side and post that in the comment section below so that it will help the other aspirants as well. So please carry out this assignment immediately after the session, post it as a comment in the comment section below. Then you can also expect few mains questions here. It's a very, very important topic because NATO's expansion and its rivalry with Russia is defining European and global geopolitics today. So take these two practice questions. You can expect mains questions on these lines. The admission of Finland and Sweden to NATO would bring about a transformation in Europe's security map. Discuss. What role did the eastward expansion of NATO play in triggering the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Critically evaluate. These are the lines on which UPSC could ask a question in mains. So with this, I would like to bring the session to an end, but don't go anywhere because I'll be answering all your questions, all your doubts and queries, and I'll help you understand the topic of NATO in complete detail. So let's take a look at the questions. What is the main aim of NATO? Like I said, the main aim of NATO is collective defense. It's a military alliance designed to secure all the NATO members against any external threat. Its main aim was to contain and counter the Russian influence, the Russian threat. Next, Shaurya is asking, is NATO a confederation? NATO is essentially an intergovernmental military alliance. Next, Ria is asking, NATO, rather than sending military, they are helping Ukraine by giving arms. Does NATO only wants to weaken Russia and then attack on Russia? That's a great question. See, Ukraine as of now is not a member of NATO, so it doesn't fall under the principle of collective defense, right? But after Russia threatened Ukraine, after it captured the Crimean Peninsula and eventually sponsored a separatist war, right? And even it has invaded the country today. But the NATO countries haven't come to the direct defense of Ukraine, meaning they haven't opened a direct front with Russia. Instead, they have limited themselves to indirect support. Through covert routes, they are supplying weapons and funds to Ukraine so that it can resist the Russian attack. The NATO countries would never go to a direct conflict with Russia because both the sides are nuclear armed. They would never take the risk, but they are going to keep it limited to such a covert war by using Ukraine as a proxy, right? That is what the NATO countries are doing. Next, Vismaya, did NATO ever request India to join their alliance? That is the assignment I gave you. Please check and read about the membership criteria. Just check whether India can apply for NATO's membership or not, right? Can NATO admit any observers if not members? That's a small exercise I've given, a small assignment. Please do that and post the points in the comment section. Next question, why does Turkey oppose inclusion of Sweden and Finland in NATO? See, Turkey has very important geopolitical calculations over here. Generally, Sweden and Finland were neutral countries. Even during the Cold War, Sweden and Finland, they largely remained neutral. Even though officially they had a neutral policy, sometimes, especially Finland, would be seen to be siding with Russia unofficially. Either it wouldn't oppose Russian actions during the Cold War, that is Soviet Union's actions, or sometimes it would indirectly favor it, even though officially its position was to maintain neutrality. So Finland and Sweden have largely been neutral, but sometimes they have been aligning with Soviet Union and Russia. Turkey, on the other hand, has a very complex relationship with Russia as well. There are areas where Turkey, Russia collaborate and work together. They also have their own strategic rivalry going on, mainly because of the Turkish Straits, which Russia seeks to control and dominate. Turkey also has a complex relationship with the United States, right? There are many areas where US and Turkey work together. In fact, the NATO countries and US, they have a major military presence in Turkey. Most of their campaigns in Syria and in other places of Middle East, they are carried out through the military bases in Turkey. At the same time, they have a rivalry, they have a complicated relationship as well due to certain geopolitical complications. So Turkey doesn't want a further expansion of NATO, and in this case, the reason why it is mainly opposing Sweden and Finland's membership is to indirectly favor Russia, because Turkey does have a close relationship with Russia as well. Next question, please. Why is NATO still not dissolved after disintegration of USSR? See, yes, NATO was set up to counter the Soviet Union, but the NATO countries would never give up their military dominance just because the Soviet Union collapsed. Even after Soviet Union disintegrated, the successor state, that is Russia, was still seen as a threat by the Western countries. So NATO is a military platform, a military alliance of the Western countries to extend their dominance in Europe. So NATO will never be disintegrated. It will never be dissolved. Next, I think this is the last question. Who can be members of NATO and qualifications? That is the exercise I gave you. That's the assignment. Please read about it and post it in the comment section. So with this, I would like to bring my discussion to an end. I hope it was a fruitful session. Do let us know by liking the video, share your comments, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. And also, tomorrow, again, we'll go live at 10 a.m. and 3 p.m. Don't miss these live sessions, which are part of the knowledge series. So thank you for supporting us. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again in the next session.